Welcome to Reinvent and the Reinvent the Humanities to Change the World series, which is done in partnership with Georgetown University. I'm Pete Leiden. I'm the founder of Reinvent, and I'm going to be conducting the interview today. And today we have Edward Maloney. Edward is, or goes by Eddie, is actually a member of the Georgetown community. He is the executive director of the Center for New Designs in Learning and Scholarship. And essentially this is a research center that deals with teaching, looking hard at teaching, learning, and also the use of technology, particularly in technology-enhanced learning. And that's been around since about 2000 in Georgetown. We're going to talk to him a little bit about that center and what it's doing in relation to this larger series. He's also a professor in English literature at Georgetown. His expertise is in modernism, postmodernism, also thinking about narrative and narrative theory on top of that. And so we'll be talking a little bit about that as well. But in general, we are here to talk about how to think through the role of the humanities and its importance going forward the next couple decades here. So, Eddie, great to have you here.
Thank you very much. I'm very excited to talk with you.
I mean, one of the things you could maybe start is explain a little bit about this center, and just tell us a little bit about what you're after there and what you're kind of trying to accomplish.
Yeah, so you're right. Our center's been in existence since 2000, and we came in existence in response to an intellectual life committee report at the university that indicated we really needed to have a center for teaching excellence at Georgetown. We didn't have something that was focused on that at the time, and when we put the center together, we actually really paid attention to the integration between teaching, technology, and assessment, sort of three big areas that we think are important and that really drive a lot of the work that we do. So we consider ourselves a center for teaching excellence, a center for technology innovation, and a center for assessment and analytics, and we kind of wrap all of that around in a kind of research space. The center is called the Center for New Designs in Learning and Scholarship, and we end up calling that Candles on campus, so we're fairly well known as Candles.
Now, when you say the technology piece of this, I know technology has been layering in increasingly into higher education and being seen as somewhat disruptive as well. Given the Georgetown community, are you dealing with both the humanities side of things as well as science and engineering, and is it the broadest sense of all of Georgetown's kind of things? And I just kind of like to put this in context, how much the humanities is also kind of using these new techniques.
Well, so great question, and it's certainly the case that the work that we do cuts across the entire university. So we work with the medical center, we work with the law campus, and we work with the main campus here, and that includes all the different disciplines that are part of the main campus at Georgetown. The humanities through the college, Georgetown College, is certainly one of the spaces where we do a lot of our work. A lot of the technology-enhanced learning that we see happening at Georgetown comes through the humanities. And it's become, I think, a center for thinking about the relationship between humanities and teaching. What does it mean for us to, between technology and teaching, and the humanities has become. What does it mean for us to think about the role that technology is playing at a university that really sees the value of humanities at its core, where I think we take very seriously our Jesuit and Catholic history, and we very much believe in a kind of student-centered university, and all of those things can be challenged by certain kinds of technologies and the way that technology has become part of what we think about in teaching and learning in higher education. And so one of the things that we try to do is bridge those gaps, make sure that the work that we do with technology allows us to focus on the individual student as much as on the broader questions that are really at the core of the humanities.
So when you say technology, I mean, it's just kind of generic term. I mean, give us a little more concrete sense of the kinds of technologies, online technologies or other technologies. I mean, give us some sense of what you mean by that.
Right. So,
go ahead.
Yeah. So technology, we think of technology pretty broadly, but we're talking about teaching and learning technologies, and so that runs the range of technologies that you would actually employ in the classroom, technologies that you would employ to manage the course, to deliver content in new ways, and then technologies that would help you teach in the online space in a kind of both hybrid as well as fully online modality. And we actually look at all of those technologies. We're thinking about the way the classrooms are set up. We work with our classroom educational technology group to actually think about what are the best layouts for classrooms and the best integration of technology that'll have the greatest impact on students. We think about the kinds of technologies that we're really focusing on these days around personalized and adaptive learning. So the technologies that are not necessarily only in the online space, but certainly allow students to do work outside of the classroom context in an online space, and then bring that thinking back to the classroom. So the full range. So whether that's a mobile technology using an iPad or a tablet device in the classroom, whether that's the more traditional technologies that you would find to present materials, a projector, screens that you'd have in a classroom, smart boards and things of that nature, to really the kind of fully immersive, adaptive applications that we're really starting to develop in higher ed to help create a kind of a really rich and deep learning experience for students.
Well, I know there's been a lot of talk and a lot of work in MOOCs, massively online kind of courses, essentially. And without really saying it there, you kind of alluded to kind of online learning and things like that. But could you talk a little bit about to what extent, if any, you're actually working with how to scale up kind of some of these things for distance learning, or people from larger kind of scale of people in these kind of situations?
Yeah, so Georgetown got involved with MOOCs in 2012. We partnered with edX, which is one of the major MOOC providers in the country. Coursera and edX are kind of splitting, I think, some of the work that's happening in the MOOC space, and we decided to partner with edX, which is a group out that came together as a partnership between MIT and Harvard, and then extended that partnership to a number of other schools. And Georgetown was one of the early adopters of edX. We're one of the first, I think, 6 schools to join that partnership. It's a nonprofit, which we very much believe in, and one of the reasons why there are many reasons why we got involved in that. It's a great experimental space. It certainly helps us look at what's happening in the online space in a new way, from a new vantage point. But one of the reasons that was really key to Georgetown and core to what we thought was important was actually connecting the Jesuit mission of teaching students outside of our walls, basically, to reach out to the community, to see what we're trying to do as something that's broader than just what happens on the hilltop here. And the MOOC space was a really, I think, exciting opportunity to do that. We imagined that we'd be able to work with students across the globe, and in some cases we have. We've been doing it now for 3 years. We've got about 10 different MOOCs and a bunch other in the pipeline. And all sorts of different topics, from the social sciences to the sciences to the humanities. And one of the things that we decided we really wanted to do when we entered that space was teach to Georgetown's core strengths. And as I said earlier, Georgetown really takes the humanities seriously. It's part of our core value system. And so a lot of the courses that we try to develop are in that space for us. There have been some challenges in the MOOC space, which I'm happy to talk about, but it's certainly one of the places where we think experimentation with technology-enhanced learning gives us an opportunity to really explore and experiment with this kind of work.
Well, now there has been, and again through other series and things we've done, a lot of the MOOC kind of focus has been on or let's say science and engineering and kind of courses that are more kind of geared in that kind of way. Talk to us a little bit, given that the theme of this is really the humanities, and how do we really kind of, how does the humanities do this? What are the particular essentially challenges in the humanities to kind of get online, and also kind of what are some of your thoughts on how that might be done? Well, I know you've done, in fact, you've got a project there called Dante or something around Dante that is kind of playing in this space.
Yeah, so the humanities really does represent a significant challenge, both in the MOOC space, but also online in general. A lot of what we can do in the online space, or really allows us to kind of scale, I think, in interesting ways, is rely on computer assessed or computer graded assignments, and that's really difficult to do in the humanities. As you can imagine, computers aren't very good at grading essays. They're not great at noticing patterns in dialogue and discourse in the ways that human beings can. And so to scale that kind of work and to really think in an interpretive manner becomes a significant challenge in the MOOC space. But we thought it was an important one to invest in, and we're not the only ones. But we actually tried to rethink the problem a little bit, not just to approach it from the perspective of how do we assess the student work, how do we think about what students are actually contributing to the course or what they're learning in the course, all very important things, but how we actually get students to engage with the core texts of the humanities. And so the Dante Project is a 3-course sequence, looks at the 3 books of Dante's Divine Comedy. And what we've done is we've built a platform that runs in parallel with the edX platform to get students to engage at the level of the text by doing annotations, journaling, and what we call social annotations. So they do personal private annotations, they create longer pieces, journals, and we have them then engage in dialogue around the text. And all of that happens right at the level of the text. So they'll be reading the poem, and they can annotate right there, and then they can actually communicate and engage in a dialogue with their peers. And it's been, I think, from our perspective, a pretty significant success. We've had, in the first run of these 3 modules, over 60,000 annotations occurred with the students. So when you think about the numbers on the sciences, again, it's easier to imagine that kind of scale because you can get 1,000 to 10,000 to 100,000 students who are doing multiple choice or computer-graded assessments. But when you actually try to do that at the level of what we value in the humanities, that kind of reflection, that kind of engagement with a text, that kind of interpretation, understanding, and then dialogue and discourse with your peers, it's very, very difficult to do. So to build the tool that allows students to see that, that text as a place, not just to read something and to get something personal out of it, but to see something as a space for a kind of larger dialogue with peers around the world was really important to us.
Now, one of the things that here at Reinvent we've been tracking the kind of evolution here of interactive group video and its application and how it's getting better, frankly, by the month almost. And there's tons of competition here, a lot of money going in, a lot of startups and things like that. I'm just curious. It's always occurred to me that at least my experience and understanding of how the humanities or liberal arts kind of worked in my time was a lot of small group discussions, connecting people and really looking each other in the eye and articulating your ideas and actually getting feedback on the spot. I'm curious, have you guys used kind of, or how do you view kind of interactive video like this as ways to kind of stitch people together and at least somewhat more efficiently have professors be able to interact in that kind of intimate way with students?
Yeah, it's a great question, and since I'm being reminded to look in the camera, I realize I can't actually look you in the eye as I'm answering this question. So that does present a challenge, right? I mean, the technology can be an interface, it can also be an obstacle that we have to play with as we try to figure out some ways through this. We actually did not use video from a student perspective. We talked about it. We talked about student projects that could be video-based projects, multimedia-based projects. When we teach the course on campus, we do that actually. We have students use video and multimedia to develop responses and reflections to the text. But when we did it online, the video is almost entirely from the faculty member's perspective. There are a lot of challenges in that. Getting students across the world to access the video cameras, for example, is a challenge, and then to expect that as part of the course becomes pretty difficult. Where they upload the video, access to video in different parts of the country or different parts of the world in different countries can be a challenge as well. China, for example, has often blocked access to certain video, and streaming quality can be a huge challenge there as well. So we certainly tried to think about ways we could do that, but it's still I think it's still one of those spaces where we don't have a good solution yet for that. One of the things we have tried to do, on the other hand, is make the videos more interactive. So we've used a couple of different tools to give students some branching options to go through video. So video simulations, for example, that students can respond to or engage with rather than just sit there and listen, but to create some little bit more active engagement for them. But it would be great to see if we can get there right in the future. One of the ways in which we start to think about that, and may lend itself to these kinds of solutions, to do a lot of peer assessment in humanities-based courses when you scale them. So to think about getting small cohorts of students together across the world If you could get 5, 10, 15 students together who might be able to do a group chat, you could actually, again, assuming you could rely on the video, and access to that, to those technologies throughout all of those students, you actually could do some interesting work there.
Okay, so let's just shift for a minute here to your other kind of hat you wear there. Is you're a professor in English literature, obviously one of the core humanities, literature. One of the things we've been exploring here is the value of the humanities, not just in and of itself, and there are some kind of inherent reasons to do the humanities, but as a kind of a way to get to essentially the skills and the things you develop in these spaces and the sensitivities you get through these kind of humanities, how that can be applied in actually practical ways outside of academia over the course of a career, over your life. And particularly, we're trying to connect it to, given the kind of challenges the world faces here, to what extent people steeped in the humanities or coming out of the humanities really need to be involved in a lot of the big challenges of our time. So that's a big kind of arc there that we're trying to explore here. But I'm just thinking, from your point of view, the literature and what you've studied, particularly kind of modern, postmodern literature, what is that expertise in that subject? What is that actually preparing someone in a way that, in fact, when you leave your schooling, what is that teaching you that applied outside the field? And what are the kind of things that you kind of would focus on and point out to us?
Yeah, so as you said, a big arc to try to answer. If I think about the kind of skill part first, and then maybe I can circle back to the postmodern issue, because I think they're trying to talk about skills might actually help me answer that question a little bit. So, and there's a lot of talk, I think, in sort of the public literature, news, popular press, as well as within colleges and universities, about the value of literature for developing empathy, the role of critical thinking in jobs outside of the academy, really important to all sorts of different fields, and certainly that concept of critical thinking is something we believe that we actually help students engage with. I imagine many disciplines do feel that way, so it's not necessarily only the humanities and only literature that does that, but we certainly feel like we have one way into that. And one of those, I think, ways of getting into that is through reflection, through sustained discourse and dialogue, and through an engagement over a period of time with a kind of deep, rich project. And sometimes that's an engagement with a long text. I was just reading this morning something my wife sent me on distraction technology and how technology can distract students. And I have 2 young kids who are constantly sort of faced with that tension of how much screen time do they have and what does that distraction mean. And I think we're hearing more and more about the difficulty that individuals have of even just reading a novel these days, when your mind has started to work to really kind of segment things and to chunk them and to move really quickly between different texts or different technologies. It becomes really hard to focus on a single object for a sustained period of time. And one of the things that we do in literature is ask students to do that. Right? We ask students to pay attention to something usually longer, often very difficult, challenging works that require a kind of engagement that they may not be comfortable with. And really, you can't just do that. You have to practice that. You have to engage with it over time. You have to develop that skill set. And it's this kind of skill set that when I'm hiring people, I start to value in the employees that I hire. I'm looking for them to show me that they've actually done this kind of work. They've actually engaged in something over a long period of time. They've done sustained work. They've been able to focus on a problem and not just multitask or flip between projects, but actually, do that kind of thinking that I think we value when we talk about something like critical thinking. So there are a lot of different roles, I think, that the humanities can play in building skills for students. There's obviously writing, there's communication. A big part of what I talk about with my students when I'm talking about what it means to be in the discipline of the humanities, to be in the discipline of English, to be studying literature, is to think about how you're actually engaged in a dialogue that's been happening for a long time. It's happened before you with people who've been writing the text, books that you're reading, stories that you're reading. It's happening while you're studying them. It's happening with the people who are talking about them, and it's going to happen long after you. And part of your job is to find your role in that dialogue, to figure out what it means to have a voice in that dialogue. And one of the skills I think that we're asking citizens these days, asking our students to think about as they become part of the professional workforce, is to think about what their role is, who they are, how do they engage in a larger dialogue, in a larger discourse. And I think literature is one of the great places to do that. Now, modernism and postmodernism present some challenges to that. At a kind of very fundamental, basic level, they're generally very, very difficult texts. Some of the more challenging texts to read, in part because the skills and the tools that a lot of our students develop in K through 12, and even potentially early on in college, do not necessarily help them with a lot of modernist and postmodern texts, which tend to disrupt some of their practices. And that disruption, I think, can be really useful. That idea that the kind of skill set that you've developed is not going to apply to everything, and you need to be adaptable and flexible, and you need to understand that to kind of work with a really difficult text, to work with one that challenges your reading practice, is going to take you outside your comfort zone, and that can be really beneficial when you do that. You can actually gain a lot of new skills, but it requires that sense of discomfort that we don't always build into kind of teaching and learning in higher education. It leads to I think something we often call or think about as resiliency. How resilient are our students? What does it mean for our students to be able to challenge difficult problems? And I think postmodern texts, modernist texts can do that. The students, when I teach something like James Joyce's Ulysses, for example, really feel an accomplishment, a sense of success when they've actually finished that novel. And I've actually, I think I've seen those kinds of moments of not only feeling a sense of success, but actually engaging with that sense of resiliency. So just as an example, the last time I taught Ulysses as a full seminar, we just did that novel. All of the students in that seminar decided that they wanted to read James Joyce's Finnegans Wake, which is a kind of proto-postmodern novel, very, very difficult. In many ways, much more difficult than Ulysses, in part because it really has a very limited narrative structure, is playing with language in ways that are incredibly complex to really engage with at a level of comprehension, let alone a kind of greater understanding. But one of the things about that novel that's so exciting to me, and exciting, I think, to a lot of people who teach it, is it's a very social novel. What I mean by that is it's the kind of book that you gain from reading with other people, and in fact reading aloud with other people and sharing interpretations. He is sort of compacted so much into that novel that really no one person can unpack it. You need that kind of group engagement, that group experience. And if we kind of bring that back to the skills space, so much of what we ask our students to do, ask the professionals to do these days, are be collaborative, right? Be productive and creative in a collaborative environment. And there are literary texts that can really encourage that. And I know I've been talking about for a while, but one other thing I would just say about postmodernism, and modernism to a degree as well, postmodernism challenges a lot of assumptions that we make, not just about literary texts, but about the world around us. When people think about what postmodernism is and its relationship to modernism, I think one of the more well thought of theories comes from this guy by the name of Brian McHale at Ohio State University. He talks about the difference between the epistemological dominance of modernism versus the ontological dominance of postmodernism. And what he means by that is that postmodernism really starts to force us to ask questions, not just about what we know, but about who we are and what we are. What is this world that we live in? What are these objects that we think we know really well? And it really fundamentally asks us to question some basic assumptions about how we engage with the world around us, to really kind of even challenging some of the great grand narratives that we employ in our lives: religion, politics, philosophy, all the things, science, that give us structures to meaning. It really forces us to question those, maybe not come up with different answers in the end, but at least challenge the assumptions of those. And when you do that, I think you actually put yourself in a better position to understand what's happening in the world, especially today, where there's so much disruption and so much challenge to some of our fundamental assumptions about how we should engage with each other, how we should get along, what the world is, and so on. So that was a long answer. I apologize.
Long answer, but a very, very fascinating one. The one thing I just want to go back to, because you glossed over very quickly as though it's kind of self-evident, but I don't think it is. Talk about that empathy. Unpack the idea of empathy. I mean, one of the things about it that's kind of from the, it's obvious at some level, but people don't really think it through, which is literature allows you to get inside the head of other people and really see the world in all its complexity from somebody else's head. And boy, in a world of 7 billion people and plus, and kind of increasing integration and cross-cultural connections, it seems like a valuable thing to kind of master. But to talk a little bit about, from your own perspective, of that point of it, the empathy piece.
Yeah. So again, kind of a concept, or at least an idea, in trying to invest in the value of the humanities that has been pretty popular. It's been kind of making its way in the popular press over the past year, that people who read literature, especially difficult, challenging literature, literature that is part of the kind of canon of our literary texts, the kind of what people often will call the great literature, depending on your perspective, I suppose. But that actually working with that literature has, at least in some version, been shown to increase empathy of the readers. And I think you hit the nail right on the head. The idea of getting inside someone else's head, the idea of seeing emotional connections in interactions between individuals, even as they're fictionalized, allows you to imagine what it means for you to have those kind of interactions with someone in the world, right? So in some ways, it's a way of practicing your sense of empathy, your sense of interaction, your sense of connection with other people, and that practice, I think, can have a great effect. It's also a way of seeing emotional experiences that you may not have had, right? So again, in a fictionalized context, but fictionalized context in a way that would allow people to play with emotional responses that they really couldn't play with in the world, and that can run the full range of responses from really care and love to anger and hate, right? And you can have a kind of full spectrum of responses in literature that you may not be able to really fully express, or you would want to express in the world, but you can see those played out in ways that can be really beneficial. And I'm not an expert. I don't do research in this space, so I don't know all of the data that people have been gathering to try to make this case that it does increase empathy in that way. But there are some who are making that argument that engagement with literary texts, it really is one of the ways in which we kind of fundamentally build our empathetic skills.
Okay, so in some respects you're talking about just the humanities in general, just what they are. But so let's marry the two threads here. We've been talking about how technology can kind of enhance learning and do things, and then we've talked about the value of the humanities at some level. So to what extent does digital, I don't know how you frame it, but the technologically enhanced kind of study of humanities, how does that start to, looking ahead here, change the game? Now, so certain things is, more, because of digital platforms, more people can create more things. They can create their own stories. They can, things, it's not just, those who can get something published in, through a book in, New York or something, like the old days. So there's a kind of opening it up to more creativity. There's also the idea of globally interconnecting folks, so people in parts of the world who didn't have exposure to it or access. I mean, just talk to us a little bit about the future here, as you can see it, as how the digital storytelling, the humanities, how that kind of might play out in the next 10, 20 years.
Yeah, so I think you touched on a lot of the really sort of important elements of the digital humanities and the way in which digital humanities are changing how we think about access. Access is really important, so open access is possible, and because of digital humanities in a way that it wasn't when you were reliant on print text. You were relying on kind of a physical object that had a cost associated with it in a particular way, and so on. So that access is really important. The ability to publish, to create. So we have people writing more now than ever in our history. We have people, excuse me, who are writing blogs, who are writing journal articles that are going to go online and open access texts and so on, and contributing to that dialogue that I was talking about. before in new ways, and people who may not even necessarily have been trained or experts in this, but are actually contributing to that conversation, to that dialogue. And that kind of sense of the role that digital humanities plays in the kind of materiality of the humanities and the availability, the access is really important. It's also the case that the digital humanities are giving us new ways of looking at texts. So being able to put texts into relationship with each other, being able to do research on texts that are dependent on things that computers do really well. So showing relationships between words, being able to do kind of research at the word level across text that would be very, very difficult for any one person to do, to pull corpuses together in unique ways. Those kinds of digital humanities-based projects are also new ways of thinking about the role that technology is playing in the humanities. In part, that access it becomes or connects with that sense of research in a lot of online projects about particular writers, particular texts, where you have people who will try to create, as we did with Dante and others have done with Dante, create access to texts that give individuals, students, anyone really, an opportunity to really kind of read and engage with those materials at a level that they may really only have had access to do at a university, if they even were able to, depending on the curriculum that they were in, and so on. And the third kind of piece, so if it's kind of the materiality, the access, and then kind of rethinking how we look at the digital, or look at the humanities through a kind of digital lens and what that enables us to do. But the third thing is what's being created in the digital space that actually is unique to the digital space. So there was certainly a lot of promise for digital literature in the early 90s. Sort of we were hoping, I guess, or many people were thinking this was going to be the next wave of literary texts, and to some degree we've had examples of that, but not certainly a shift like some people thought might happen to a move to the digital. Still, if you can find a bookstore, you can go in and you can see that many books are being published in in a traditional form, but we're reading them differently, right? We're reading them on Kindles and we're reading them online and so on, and that affords a particular kind of rethinking of what the literary text is, in part to really take advantage of what the digital medium allows for. It's not necessarily new. Again, kind of my work in modernism and postmodernism, we can go back and see that Joyce, I think, would have loved to have had access to digital tools to build out Ulysses and Finnegans Wake in particular. Or we look at something like Vladimir Nabokov's Pale Fire, or Cortázar's Hopscotch, where the kind of hyperfiction that they were trying to develop before the digital tools were there, were really part of their thinking about, again, kind of tearing down the assumptions of what a literary text is, challenging a kind of linear narrative, challenging even a linear discourse in ways that can be really enlightening. And so new digital tools, and video is certainly part of this, are giving us new ways of thinking about what the humanities are, what the literary text is, how we actually engage with each other, how we have access to it, but also how we create in really fundamentally new ways. And I think that runs the full range of the humanities. And when we look at the visual arts and music, what's being done now because of digital tools is really fascinating, and could never have been accomplished in quite the same way. So.
What about, I'm curious, any thoughts on what basically AI, well, think of it as language translation, basically. I mean, language translation is getting pretty good, honestly, and you could certainly see in the next 5 to 10 years it being potentially seamless, or at least get close to that kind of ubiquity of access to different languages. You could imagine in the humanities that being a really interesting play space of cross-fertilizing all these different, essentially, traditions, cultures, bodies of works, all kinds of things, which I think is not quite there yet, but you could, boy, it's getting close. Because when you really do think about it, most of the humanities do stay kind of siloed in their language, honestly. I mean, with some kind of minor, when you really think of the full volume of work in different languages, it's just a little minor crossover. What happens if that gets splayed open? In some ways, it could be really interesting. Any thoughts on that theme of technological change?
I hadn't really thought about computer translation, I guess, because it is still pretty pretty basic in its ability to work with complex texts. And translation in general is a challenge for literary texts. I often actually will do work with writers in other languages other than English, and I tend to do those in translation, and those translations tend to offer their own set of challenges. How you're going to assign a certain kind of meaning either to the original author, the translator, to kind of an engagement between the two of those. And it would be really fascinating to, if we get to a point where Google Translate or some other translation technology could actually get at the nuance of a literary text in a complex way in a different language. I'm not sure we're 5 years off from that. We might be a lot farther than that. That's one of those skills that, at least right now, I still think human beings are kind of a necessary component to that mix. We can sort of not only understand the entirety of the work, which is often important when you're translating, to think about the whole as a coherent object, but also kind of the unique atoms of that work that get put together, and how you think about those in relationship to each other and as separate. And then, when you start adding things like the poetry of a text, start thinking about really complex things like irony, satire, those become significant challenges that, at least right now, I think we're well beyond what a computer can do, and part of me hopes always will be well beyond what a computer can do. But maybe I'm being naively hopeful there. I will. It's
interesting because we literally had an interview just a few days ago with someone deeply immersed in AI and where it's going, and he was more cautious than some of the kind of real boosters that think it's right around the corner, but it's also quite remarkable how fast it's just coming around here. I think you're right in terms of irony in that kind of incredibly subtle kind of situations, but in I don't know. It'd be interesting to know. Kind of Siri-like translation is, might be closer than we think. But anyhow, we'll see about that. That's part of the discussion in this broader sense of the series. And so maybe to end the interview here, it's actually not a bad way to kind of end it. Is as you said, you hope there's certain things that'll never get eclipsed here. But as we think about the future. And we think about the challenges we're up against. We also think about the big opportunities out there. Maybe just kind of any final thoughts on how critical, essentially, the humanities are going to be towards any kind of life or society or kind of civilization we're going to want to be living in this century here. But are any thoughts on last words on the value of the humanities?
Yeah. Well, obviously I'm biased. I believe in the value of the humanities. I actually started out as a computer science major when I was an undergrad, and really kind of saw my path in a particular direction in the sciences and engineering, and really actually kind of turned to the humanities in a way because it gave me an opportunity to think in a way that really connected with me at the time. It gave me an opportunity to think about questions that were really important to me, and it gave me an opportunity to look at a range of kind of artistic and literary texts that I found really impactful to who I was becoming and who I wanted to be. And I think the humanities in general, when we think about history, we think about philosophy and ethics, we think about the role of art and literature. Many of the big questions and challenges we face today, I think, are caught up within that sense of, not only can we do something, but should we do something? I was thinking about kind of two of the kind of big world challenges we have right now. Obviously, there's a set of conflicts that are happening around the world that are driven by both ideological goals, but also religious and conflicts and tensions between people, and social and cultural. And there are going to be scientific and social solutions to those problems. There are going to be political solutions to those problems, but many of those questions are actually caught up at their core with a kind of humanistic set of values, and what do we care about, and how do we want to share these values, and how do we want to find shared values with others to try to address some of these big problems. Even something that seems, I think, fundamentally a science-based problem like climate change, really, I think as we start to play that out, has a whole set of moral and ethical challenges that we need to pay attention to. So even if we can come up with scientific solutions, we always need to understand the impact on both the individual and on the collective. We need to know what happens in countries and societies that make certain kinds of choices and the moral effect that that has on others. I think the humanities are just caught up in virtually every major both conflict, challenge that we face right now, but also opportunity. Thinking about what it means to be in this new space with new technologies and what it means to create kind of new opportunities for new art, for thinking about art in new ways. Even just the kind of role that technology is going to play in helping us gain access to the antiquities that have been destroyed recently. I mean, technology will give us something that in other times we would have just lost and not really ever been able to recover. So I don't know. To me, there continues to be kind of fundamental role for the humanities, and personally, it always kind of comes back to both in my teaching, but also just in my own sort of personal sense of how I think about what's happening in the world, is challenging assumptions, engaging in dialogue with others and in conversation, but to challenge the assumptions that we carry with us, that drive and motivate us and that drive and motivate others, to make sure that those assumptions are always interrogated. We may end up back at the same place, but if we actually take that time to interrogate those assumptions, I think we learn more about the people that we are engaging in a conversation with, and that we are trying to work with across the world. So very important, at every level. And just one other sort of space, when we think about technology and how it's affecting how we communicate. Social media is obviously a key place for that. So much of our lives, and especially our students' lives, are caught up in social media these days. And we, again, as I was sort of saying earlier about distractions of screens, one solution is to try to remove those. Another is to try to understand what the impact is and what that social space looks like. And again, the moral and ethical questions that students are involved in when they're always online, they're always talking to other people, and what it means to communicate in that space, what it means to be bullied, to respond to people who are challenging who you are and your identity and so on. These are questions that are fundamental to the humanities and how we think about the world.
Well, thank you. Those are some awesome ideas, and thanks for taking the time for the lay out the whole situation there. And we share your kind of basic, in general, your hope there, and in fact, part of the whole project is to really look hard at that and to kind of really reappreciate a lot of what the humanities bring to the table. So thank you very much, and appreciate you being with us today. Thank you.
Thank you.